The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday afternoon it had undone 3 years of careful work in the space of 30 seconds. Cecilia Marlowe was standing behind the counter of her father's shop, her shop now, though she had never quite stopped thinking of it as his. With a hat box balanced against her hip and a customer waiting for her opinion on the merits of ivory ribbon over cream. When the bell above the door rang, and Anne came in with a look on her face that meant something had gone badly wrong. Not mildly wrong. Not the kind of wrong that could be solved with a cup of tea and a practical conversation. The kind of wrong that arrived in an envelope with a wax seal and sat in your stomach like a stone. Cecilia set the hat box down on the counter without finishing her sentence to Mrs. Hadley looked at her sister's face and felt the particular cold clarity that came to her in moments of crisis. Not calm exactly, but the temporary suspension of panic that allowed her to keep moving forward. Anne was 22 and had been happy for precisely 4 months, which was how long she had been engaged to Mr. Thomas Fenwick Ross of Ashfield Park. And Cecilia was not going to let that happiness be taken from her without a fight. She just had not yet anticipated what form the fight would take, or at what cost she would enter it. The shop was not empty. Mrs. Hadley was still at the counter, examining the ivory ribbon with the focused attention of a woman who had nothing more pressing to do with her afternoon. 2 other customers moved between the display stands near the window, lifting hat forms and turning them in the light. The young apprentice, Dora, was pinning a brim at the workbench in the corner. Cecilia was aware of all of them in the way she was always aware of the room, a habit of 3 years running a business on the goodwill of women who talked to one another. And she was aware, too, of the bell above the door sounding a second time as she took the letter from Anne's hand and read it. Mrs. Fenwick Ross, mother of the groom, had written to inquire after the family into which her son was marrying. The inquiry was polite in its phrasing and precise in its target. She had noted in the course of her social correspondence that the elder Miss Marlowe remained unmarried at the age of 26, and she wished to understand whether there was any particular reason for this circumstance, as she felt it reflected upon the character of the family as a whole. And she would, of course, wish to be reassured before the wedding at Ashfield Park proceeded at the end of the following week. Anne said very quietly, "She means to call it off." Cecilia said, "She means to try." She was still holding the letter when she heard footsteps behind her. Not Anne's, not Dora's, not the soft shoe leather of any of the 3 customers she'd already accounted for. These were heavier. A man's step, measured and unhurried, moving toward the counter with the ease of someone who had been in rooms like this before and found nothing in them to unsettle him. Cecilia turned. He was tall, and he was looking at her with the mildly interested expression of a man who had walked into a situation he did not yet fully understand, but was in no particular hurry to leave. Dark coat, good cloth, the kind of ease in the shoulders that came from never having had to think about whether he belonged somewhere. He had, she would think later, the face of a man who listened carefully and showed very little of what he concluded. She did not know him. She knew of him, in the way that everyone in their particular social radius knew of him. Lucian Gray, the Duke of Wexbourne, whose younger sister Eleanor had been a customer of the shop for 2 years and who had, evidently, sent her brother to collect the headpiece she had ordered for the Fenwick Ross wedding. Cecilia had not met him. She had exchanged notes with Eleanor Gray, had fitted Eleanor Gray's measurements into a design she was quietly proud of, had never once expected to see the Duke of Wexbourne standing at her counter with a look of polite inquiry on his face. Mrs. Hadley was watching. The 2 customers by the window had turned. Dora had stopped pinning. Cecilia Marlowe said the first reckless thing of her adult life. "You'll forgive the delay," she said, to no one in particular, and to everyone simultaneously. My fiancé has only just arrived, and I had not expected him until this evening. She turned back to Mrs. Hadley with the hatbox and the ribbon and her most composed expression. I believe we settled on the cream, didn't we? It sits better in candlelight. The Duke of Wexbourne stood in the doorway of the Marlowe millinery shop and heard himself announced as engaged to a woman he had never spoken to in his life. He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She had turned back to Mrs. Hadley with the ribbon and was saying something about the grain of the satin. But the set of her shoulders told him everything he needed to know about the state she was in. The letter was still in her other hand. Her sister, standing 2 feet away, had gone very still. Lucian Gray took in the room. He took in the customers, the apprentice, the sister, the letter, and the particular quality of silence that had settled over the shop in the 3 seconds since Cecilia Marlowe had said what she had said. He crossed the room, set his hat on the counter, and greeted her the way a man greets a woman he has known for some time and finds entirely unremarkable to be near. You said 7 o'clock, he said. I came early. I hope that's not inconvenient. She turned to look at him then, just for a moment. Her expression did not change, but something in it shifted. A fractional recalibration, a door opening an inch and then closing again. And then she said, not at all, and went back to the ribbon. Mrs. Hadley bought the cream. The other customers finished their browsing and left. Dora was sent to fetch Eleanor Gray's hatbox from the back. The shop settled into the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon, and Lucian Gray stood at the counter and waited, with every appearance of a man who had nowhere else to be, for the room to empty. When the last customer had gone and Dora had been sent on an errand that would take her at least 20 minutes, Cecilia Marlowe led him into the back room without asking whether he wanted to come and closed the door. The room was narrow and useful. Shelves of hat forms, stacked bolts of ribbon and silk, the work table she used for fittings and measurements. Hat boxes were piled 3 deep along the far wall. It was not a room designed for conversation. It would have to do. She turned to face him. I owe you an explanation, she said. You owe me nothing, Lucian said. You can tell me what happened if you'd like. She told him, briefly, plainly, without apology, the letter, Anne's engagement, Mrs. Fenwick Ross's implication. She did not perform distress. She laid the facts out like a set of accounts, and he listened without interrupting, which she noted. So, she said when she had finished. 1 week. The wedding is at Ashfield Park. The family assembles on Friday. You would need to be present for the arrival, the card party, the dinner, the wedding breakfast. We would need a consistent account of how we met and how long the engagement has stood, and we would need to be convincing in company without being. She stopped. Without being unconvincing, Lucian said. Without being obviously false, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up a spool of ribbon from the work table, not idly, but with the focused attention of a man who touches things when he thinks, and set it down again. I have a condition, he said. Cecilia waited. Don't ask me why I'm willing. Not yet. She looked at him steadily. That seems like a significant omission. It is, he agreed. I'll tell you when I'm ready to. In the meantime, I'll give you everything you need. A plausible history, a convincing manner, and my full attention for the week. In exchange, you give me the same. We agree on the story now. We part after the wedding breakfast with a mutually arranged understanding that the engagement has dissolved quietly, and neither of us is worse for it. "And your sister's headpiece?" Cecilia said. He looked briefly surprised, and then amused. "I'll take it with me." They settled the practical details across the work table. They had met 6 months ago, at a dinner in Grosvenor Square. Eleanor had introduced them. The engagement had been private, pending the resolution of some family matters on his side. They had told no one yet, which was why there had been no notice in the papers. This last detail was true in the most useful sense. It explained the absence of evidence without requiring them to produce any. Cecilia wrote nothing down. She had the kind of memory that worked best under pressure, which was the only kind of memory she had ever needed. They agreed on a departure time for Friday. They agreed that she would write to him with the address at Ashfield and any additional information about the assembled family that he should know before arrival. They agreed, with the efficiency of two people who had conducted negotiations before, that they would not manufacture warmth, only accuracy. Warmth, she said, could be implied. He said he thought that was probably right. He picked up Eleanor's hatbox. She moved to open the back door for him, and he offered his hand, the ordinary gesture of a concluded agreement. And she shook it. His grip was firm and specific, the kind that meant he was paying attention. She realized afterward that neither of them had let go at the natural moment. There was a beat past that moment, 2 beats, before they separated, and neither of them mentioned it. He left through the back. She stood at the work table for a moment, her hand still carrying the slight warmth of the contact. And then she went back to the front of the shop and finished the afternoon's work. Ashfield Park announced itself through the carriage window as a long stone facade with too many windows, set in grounds that had been designed to impress and largely succeeded. Cecilia had been there once before, 2 years ago, for a garden party at which she had sold 4 hat commissions and eaten very good strawberries. She had not been there as a guest. The distinction was not lost on her. Lucian was already in the carriage when it collected her. He had arranged it, which she had not expected, and which she chose not to examine too closely. He was reading when she got in, and he set the book aside without being asked, and looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of a greeting. Direct, unhurried, slightly assessing. "You look exactly right," he said. She accepted the observation with a brief nod. "Thank you." They reviewed the story once more on the journey, not because either of them had forgotten it, but because repetition made it feel more real, and real was what they needed to be in the next 20 minutes. She told him what she had learned from Anne about the assembled guests. Mrs. Fenwick Ross's sister and her husband, 2 families from the county who were friends of the groom's family, and a handful of Thomas's friends from his years in London. She told him what Anne had said about Mrs. Fenwick Ross herself. Precise, socially ambitious, with a particular gift for asking questions that were not questions. "She'll go for the gaps," Cecilia said. "The things we haven't accounted for. How we address each other in company, how we behave when we think no one is watching. Then we behave consistently whether anyone is watching or not," Lucian said. "That's easier than managing 2 registers." She looked at him. "You've done this before." "I've been a duke in public for 11 years, he said. "Every dinner is a performance of some kind." The carriage turned up the drive, and the gravel crunched beneath the wheels. And the assembled guests who had come out to meet the new arrivals arranged themselves on the front steps in the particular configuration of people who are curious, but attempting to appear merely welcoming. Anne was there. She saw Cecilia, and her face went through 3 emotions in rapid succession before settling on relief. And beside Anne was Thomas. who had his mother's eyes and his own pleasant, slightly anxious manner. And at the center of the receiving line, with a smile that reached exactly as far as her cheekbones and no further, stood Mrs. Fenwick Ross. Lucian stepped down from the carriage first and offered his hand to help Cecilia down. And when she took it and stepped onto the gravel, he offered his arm for the walk across the drive. She took it. The gravel was uneven, which was reason enough, and his forearm was steady beneath her hand, which was useful. But when they were 3 steps from the carriage and the ground had leveled out, and there was no longer any practical requirement for the contact, his other hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his arm. Briefly, deliberately, with a warmth that had nothing to do with balance. And she registered it the way she registered a stitch that was a 1 count off. Precisely. Immediately. And without being able to stop thinking about it. Mrs. Fenwick Ross greeted them with both hands extended and the smile that did not reach her eyes. "Your Grace," she said. "And Miss Marlowe. What a delight." "Mrs. Fenwick Ross," Lucian said, with the particular warmth of a man who was genuinely pleased to be somewhere, which Cecilia suspected was not entirely performance. "You've made the house look extraordinary. We were admiring the grounds on the way up." "You're very kind." Mrs. Fenwick Ross turned to Cecilia. "And how long has this engagement been standing, Miss Marlowe? We've heard so little of it." 6 months, Cecilia said. "We were waiting for the right moment to make it more widely known." "And yet nothing in the notices," Mrs. Fenwick Ross said pleasantly. "We preferred to tell people ourselves," Lucian said, "rather than let them read it over their morning tea. Miss Marlowe has strong opinions about correspondence being personal." He glanced at Cecilia with the slight, familiar smile of a man quoting a known preference, and she felt the room shift in their favor by several degrees. "How charming," said Mrs. Fenwick Ross, and her smile did not change at all. They were shown to their rooms, separate, which was correct and expected. And Cecilia stood at her window for a moment, looking out at the grounds and revising her estimate of the week ahead. Mrs. Fenwick Ross was not going to be satisfied with a single answer. She was going to probe, carefully and persistently, until she found the gap. The question was whether the gap existed. Cecilia thought about his hand on hers on the gravel drive. She thought about the way he had said Miss Marlowe has strong opinions, as though he had been in dozens of conversations where this had come up. She thought that the gap might be smaller than she had anticipated, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. The card party was held in the long drawing room on the second evening, which Mrs. Fenwick Ross had arranged with the precision of a woman who understood that card games were useful primarily as an excuse to seat people where you wanted them. Cecilia found herself at a table with Mrs. Fenwick Ross, the groom's aunt, and a Mrs. Caldwell from the county whose husband owned a neighboring estate and whose main interest appeared to be confirming whatever Mrs. Fenwick Ross thought about anything. The first half hour passed without incident. The cards were played, the conversation moved through the wedding arrangements and the weather and the expected guests for the breakfast. Cecilia held her cards and listened and said the right things at the right intervals and was aware the entire time of Lucian at the table across the room. She could hear his voice occasionally, unhurried and pleasant, and she found it unexpectedly steadying. Then Mrs. Fenwick Ross, with the timing of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment, set down her cards and said, "I believe your father was a tradesman, Miss Marlowe. A hatter, wasn't it?" "A milliner," Cecilia said. "Yes." "How industrious." Mrs. Fenwick Ross smiled at Mrs. Caldwell. "I always think it speaks well of a family when the daughters learn a trade, though one does wonder." She paused, with the air of someone choosing her words carefully, while having already chosen them. Whether it is quite what the Duke's family expected. A connection to trade, I mean. The Grey family is very old. The table had gone quiet. Mrs. Caldwell was looking at her cards. The groom's aunt was looking at the window. Cecilia drew breath. She did not need to draw it, as it turned out, because Lucien was already there. She had not heard him cross the room, but his hand was at the small of her back, a brief and deliberate pressure. And he was saying, with the pleasant authority of a man correcting a minor factual error, "My mother has been asking Cecilia for her opinion on the new millinery designs from Paris for the past 3 months. I'm afraid she's become entirely dependent on her judgment." He glanced at Mrs. Fenwick Ross with a smile that was warm and entirely impenetrable. "I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. I believe my mother mentioned writing to you about the hat she wore to the Grantham Assembly, the one that caused such a favorable comment." Mrs. Fenwick Ross's smile shifted by a fraction. "I don't believe she mentioned it, no." "She'll be sorry to hear that," Lucien said. "She was very pleased with it." He looked at Cecilia with the easy familiarity of a man who has had this conversation before and finds it pleasant. "You used the gray silk, didn't you? For the brim?" "The dove gray," Cecilia said. "Your mother was right that it sat better than the charcoal." The conversation moved on. Mrs. Caldwell said something about the weather. The groom's aunt picked up her cards. Mrs. Fenwick Ross smiled and said nothing. And the insult was made to look, by the time the hand was finished, like a misunderstanding so minor as to be barely worth remembering. Afterward, walking back through the candlelit corridor toward the stairs, Cecilia and Lucien fell into step together and did not immediately separate the way they might have done if either of them had been thinking about it clearly. "She invented the letter from your mother," Cecilia said. Lucien kept his voice low. "Yes. She wanted me to contradict it. She wanted to see how you handled being wrong-footed in public." He paused. "You didn't." "I had help. You were already managing it," he said. "I only gave you a second to finish." They walked a few more steps. Somewhere ahead, 2 of the other guests were saying goodnight to each other, and their voices echoed pleasantly in the corridor. "She's not doing this because she dislikes me," Cecilia said. "Or not only that." "No," Lucien agreed. "She needs a scandal. Something large enough to redirect the conversation away from something else." He glanced at her. "Ask Anne what Thomas's debts look like." Cecilia stopped walking. "You know about the debts." "I know about the type of woman who needs someone else's reputation more urgently than she needs her own social standing," he said. "The reason is usually financial. The shape of it is usually someone else's money." He said it without satisfaction, as though it were simply a fact about the world he had learned, and would rather not have needed to. "Ask Anne." Quietly. Cecilia looked at him in the corridor light. He was looking ahead, not at her, and she thought that this was the first conversation they had had that had nothing to do with the performance. No audience, no management, no coordination of the story. Just 2 people comparing notes on a room they had both been reading carefully. She recalibrated. She had been doing it all week, and she was running out of room to move in the direction of lower. The orangery was at the east end of the house, accessible through a door off the morning room. And in the early morning, it was full of pale light and the smell of growing things and the particular quiet of a space that no one else had thought to occupy yet. Mrs. Fenwick Ross had chosen it for the meeting, which told Cecilia something about her preference for neutral-seeming ground. She was already there when Cecilia arrived, standing near the central table with a piece of paper in her hand, and the expression of a woman who has been holding something for some time and is ready to put it down. "I thought you might like to see this," Mrs. Fenwick Ross said, and set the paper on the table. It was a printed announcement notice. The engagement of Miss Cecilia Marlowe of London to Lucian Gray, Duke of Wexbourne. Typeset, formal, the kind of thing that appeared in the social pages of the papers that circulated through every drawing room in the county. It was dated 3 days ago. Cecilia read it once, and then again, and kept her face entirely still. "It's circulating," Mrs. Fenwick Ross said. "I received it this morning from 2 separate correspondents. I thought it better to show it to you directly." Her tone was that of a woman performing a kindness she does not intend. "I had understood the engagement was being kept private." "It was," Cecilia said. "And yet?" Cecilia folded the notice and thanked her, and left the orangery, and spent the rest of the morning with the particular controlled blankness of someone who is not performing calm, but genuinely does not yet know what she feels. That night, she went back to the orangery alone, and Lucien was already there. She was not entirely surprised. She set the folded notice on the table between them. "Did you arrange this?" she said. His answer was immediate. "No." She looked at him. He met her eyes without deflection. "Someone heard the rumor from the shop," he said. "Assumed it was fact. Passed it to a correspondent who passes things to the papers. It happens." He paused. "I didn't place it. But you haven't corrected it." The silence was a beat longer than it needed to be. He held her gaze. "No, I haven't." Cecilia waited. "For 1 week, Lucian said, I have been treated like a person. Not a title, not a prospect, not a problem to be managed by my mother or a prize to be angled for by every family with a daughter of suitable age." He said it simply, without self-pity, looking at the notice on the table rather than at her. "You needed something from me, and I agreed to provide it. And in exchange you have asked me nothing that was a calculation about what you stood to gain. You have argued with me. You have corrected me when I was wrong about the cream ribbon and the charcoal silk." He paused. "I am not ready to give that back. That is the truth of why I haven't corrected it. It is not a strategy." Cecilia stood very still. "I stopped being able to find the edge of it," she said finally. "Days ago. I don't know when it happened." He looked at her then. "I kept telling myself I knew exactly where the performance ended," she said. "And then I would notice something. The way you listened to Mrs. Hadley about the ribbon as though it mattered. The way you remembered what I'd said about the dove gray. And I would try to put it back in the right category, and it wouldn't go." "What category did you try?" he said. "Useful," she said. "Convincing. Good at the role. And?" She looked at the notice on the table, and it didn't stay there. Neither of them moved for a moment. Outside the orangery glass, the night was very dark, and the lamps in the house cast long reflections across the garden. "We still have a problem," Cecilia said. "Several," Lucian agreed. "The notice is circulating. We can't uncirculate it without a denial, and a denial will—" "Make it worse," he said. "Yes, I've been thinking about that." "We get through the wedding," Cecilia said. "We address the notice afterward, quietly, with a mutually agreed account of the dissolution. That was always the plan." "It was," he said. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the plan had been made by 2 people who were not the same people they were now, and that the plan had assumed a cleaner separation between what was invented and what was not. They left the orangery separately, and they left more frightened than when the conversation had begun, and neither of them slept particularly well. The letter arrived on the fourth morning, tucked between two other pieces of correspondence that had been forwarded from London, and Cecilia read it at the small writing desk in her room, with the same careful stillness she brought to everything that needed to be survived rather than solved. Two of the shop's most reliable patrons, Mrs. Hartwell, who ordered 6 hats a season without fail, and Lady Croft, whose standing commission had been one of the shop's most dependable sources of income for 2 years, had written to cancel their orders. The reason, in both letters, was phrased with the particular delicacy of women who did not wish to be unkind, but felt they had no choice. A rumor had reached London that the engagement was a fabrication, that the Marlowe family had been circulating a false connection to a ducal house in order to secure social advantage, and that they felt it was better, under the circumstances, to make other arrangements. Cecilia folded both letters and put them in the inside pocket of her traveling case. She did not show them to Lucian. She went down to breakfast and was entirely composed and said the right things at the right moments, and was aware throughout the meal of Lucian watching her with the attention of someone who had noticed something change. She pulled back. She could feel herself doing it. The small recalibrations, the extra half-inch of distance, the return to pure management. And she could not entirely stop it, because the shop was what remained when everything else was stripped away. And the shop was now at risk, and the instinct to protect it was older and stronger than anything she had discovered in the past 4 days. Lucian noticed. She knew he noticed because he was the kind of man who paid attention to the specific detail. And the specific detail of her manner had shifted. And he was not the kind of man to miss that. On the second day of the withdrawal, his mother arrived. The Dowager Duchess of Wexbourne had come, ostensibly, for a social call with Mrs. Fenwick Ross, with whom she had an acquaintance of long standing. She was a tall woman, with Lucian's eyes, and considerably less patience for ambiguity, and she cornered her son in the library before luncheon and made herself plain. "The announcement notice," she said. "I would like to understand it." "There is an engagement," Lucian said. His mother's voice was level. "Lucian, there is an engagement," he said again, "and I would prefer you to take that at face value until after the wedding." His mother studied him with the expression of a woman who had been studying him for 33 years and had developed a fairly accurate methodology. "She is a milliner," she said. "She runs a millinery business," Lucian said. "Her father built it. She has kept it running for 3 years since his death. I find I have more respect for that than I do for most of what passes as accomplishment in our social circle." His mother was quiet for a moment. "You are not performing for me," she said. "I know what it looks like when you perform." He met her eyes directly. "No, I'm not." She left without pressing further, which was, from her, a form of trust. But the conversation had been overheard. Or rather, the fact of the conversation had been observed. And in a house full of people who were paying attention to exactly this kind of thing, observation was enough. Lucian made a decision. He reduced the warmth of his manner in company, not coldly, not sharply, but measurably. He was pleasant, he was present, but the particular attentiveness he'd been giving Cecilia in public became more restrained, more ducal, and less personal. He told himself it was tactical. He told himself that lowering the temperature of the scrutiny on her was worth the cost of the distance. Cecilia read it exactly the way he had feared she would. She sat alone in her room that evening, not performing distress, simply looking at the account books she had brought with her and recalculating what was left to salvage. 2 canceled orders, possibly more to follow. The shop could survive it if the damage was contained quickly, if the dissolution after the wedding was managed cleanly, if the story was that the engagement had ended by mutual agreement and no one's name was damaged in the process. She had done harder things than this. She had done harder things every week for 3 years. She did not let herself think about the orangery, or the notice on the table, or what she had said about not being able to find the edge of it. That had been honesty, and honesty was a luxury she was not currently in a position to afford. She had not meant to fall asleep in the orangery. She had gone there because it was quiet, and because she needed to think without the noise of the house around her. And she had brought the account books, and she had been working through the figures for the better part of an hour when she heard the door, and looked up. Lucian came in without being invited, and did not leave. He looked at the account books on the table, and at her face, and at the particular quality of the lamplight. And he sat down across from her, and said, "Tell me what the letters said." She looked at him. "What letters?" "The ones you put in your traveling case on Thursday morning," he said. "You've been different since then." She told him. Not the way she had told him about Anne's letter, not briskly, not with a performance of composure, but plainly, with the figures, because the figures were what made it real. 2 patrons, the specific amounts, what they represented as a proportion of the shop's quarterly income. He listened without interrupting. "Out?" "I pulled back," he said, when she had finished. "In company. I know you noticed." "I thought," she started. "I know what you thought," he said. "You thought I was protecting myself." He looked at the table. My mother arrived, and I could see that her scrutiny was the most likely thing to force a public denial. And a public denial would be worse for the shop than anything Mrs. Fenwick Ross could manage. I thought if I reduced the temperature, I reduced the risk. He paused. "I should have told you. I made a tactical decision without telling you, and you read it as confirmation," she said quietly. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." She looked at him across the work table, across the account books and the lamp, and she did not immediately believe him. Not because she thought he was lying, but because she had been wrong before about what men meant when they said things, and the cost of being wrong now was higher than it had ever been. "The broken engagement," she said. 3 years ago. Something shifted in his face. Not closing, the opposite. An opening, careful and deliberate, the way you open a window in a room that has been shut for a long time. "Her name was Miss Harrington," he said. "She was very beautiful and very intelligent, and she wept in public on 3 separate occasions in a way that made everyone in the room want to protect her." He set his hands flat on the table. "She never once asked me a question about myself that wasn't a calculation. What the estates brought in, whether the entail could be broken, whether my mother's jointure would reduce the income available after the marriage." He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness. "I don't think she was a bad person. I think she was practical in the way that women in her position have to be practical. But I had—" He stopped. "What?" Cecilia said. "I had thought she was interested in me," he said. "Not the title. Me. And I was wrong, and I have spent 3 years being very careful not to be wrong about that again." He reached across the table then, not for her hand, but for the loose pin that had been slipping from her hair for the past 20 minutes, the one she had been ignoring because she was thinking about other things. He took it between his fingers with the precise, unhurried attention of someone who has noticed a small thing going wrong and intends to correct it, and he tucked it back into place. "You do that," he said, "for other women's hats." "Yes," she said. "You notice when something is wrong. It's a habit," she said. "You can't turn it off." He looked at her steadily. "I know." They worked through the problem of the notice and the shop and what came after the wedding for another hour. She made notes in the margin of the account book. He suggested 2 approaches, and she rejected one and improved the other. The lamp burned low. Outside, the garden was dark and still. She was mid-sentence, something about the timing of the denial, whether it should proceed or follow the wedding breakfast. When she realized she was not finishing the sentence, because she was asleep. She had not slept properly in 3 days. The account books were in front of her, and his shoulder was beside her, and her body had apparently decided, without consulting her, that this was the safest place it had been in some time. Lucian Gray did not move for an hour. He sat in the lamplight in the orangery at Ashfield Park and looked at the account books and the garden and the sleeping woman beside him. And he did not move. And he did not think about what came after the wedding. And he did not pretend, even to himself, that this was still a performance. The wedding breakfast marquee had been set with white cloth and early summer flowers, and the light through the canvas walls was warm and golden. And Anne Marlowe was now Mrs. Thomas Fenwick Ross, and was sitting beside her husband with the face of someone who cannot quite believe her own happiness and is afraid to look at it too directly in case it disappears. Cecilia sat 3 places down and watched her sister's face and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was that the week had been worth it regardless of what came next. Anne was married. Anne was happy. The thing that needed doing had been done. She was thinking this when Mrs. Fenwick Ross stood up. The room did not immediately quiet, but it quieted within a few seconds. The particular hush that falls when someone rises at a wedding breakfast with an expression that is not quite celebratory. Mrs. Fenwick Ross had the printed notice in her hand. She had been holding it, Cecilia realized, since the beginning of the meal. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Lucian across the table with the pleasant precision of a woman playing her final card. "I wonder if you might settle a question that has been on the minds of several of us this week." She set the notice on the table and smoothed it flat. "This announcement has been circulating widely. I believe the assembled families would appreciate a confirmation from you directly that it reflects the truth." The Marquis was very quiet. Mrs. Fenwick Ross's expression was the expression of a woman who expects hesitation. She had built the whole construction on hesitation, on the half-second pause, the slight shift, the tell that would expose the fiction and bring the whole week's careful work down around Cecilia's head. Lucian stood. He did not hesitate. But he also did not say what Cecilia expected him to say. "The engagement began," he said to the room, in the quiet, carrying voice of a man who has decided to stop managing the situation and simply tell the truth. As a kindness between 2 people who needed one. Miss Marlowe needed a fiancé for a week, and I needed... He stopped for a moment, and the stop was not uncertainty but the specific pause of a man choosing the exact right word. I needed to be somewhere that nobody wanted anything from me. That was the arrangement. The Marquis was absolutely still. Anne's hand had found Thomas's arm. "Somewhere in the last week," Lucian said, "it stopped being an arrangement." He looked at Cecilia, not at the room, not at Mrs. Fenwick Ross, not at the assembled families with their assembled opinions, at Cecilia. "I don't know, standing here, whether it has for her. I should have asked her that before I stood up, and I didn't, because I am apparently better at managing situations than I am at saying what I mean until it's too late to say it quietly." He paused. "So I am saying it in front of witnesses, which is not my preference, but which seems to be what this week has required." The silence went on for 3 full seconds. Mrs. Fenwick Ross was still standing. She'd not achieved what she intended. The room had not turned toward scandal. It had turned toward something else entirely, something that had no room in it for her printed notice and her careful campaign. And her expression showed the particular blankness of a woman whose lever has moved the wrong thing. Cecilia stood. She looked at Mrs. Fenwick Ross first, because that was what needed doing. And she did it with the same directness she brought to everything that needed to be survived. "The rumor that reached London," she said. "The one that said the engagement was a fraud and the Marlowe family was trading on a false connection. That rumor has already cost my shop 2 standing orders. I know the specific amounts. I know which patrons received which correspondence and when." She let that sit for a moment. "I also know that a woman who needs a scandal badly enough to manufacture one in someone else's direction usually needs it because something closer to home is about to become visible. I would suggest, Mrs. Fenwick Ross, that whatever your son's debts look like at present, they will look considerably worse if this morning's conversation becomes the story that circulates instead of the one you intended." Mrs. Fenwick Ross sat down. The room exhaled. Somewhere near the back of the marquee, someone began the quiet, necessary work of resuming a conversation. And then someone else joined them. And within 30 seconds, the wedding breakfast was a wedding breakfast again. Warm and full of flowers, and the particular happiness of a room that has decided to choose celebration over spectacle. Anne caught Cecilia's eye across the table. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Cecilia turned to find Lucian still looking at her, and she said very quietly, so that only he could hear it, "You should have asked me before you stood up." "I know," he said. "I'm asking now." "Not here," she said. The garden at Ashfield was cooler than the marquee and quieter, and the old yew hedge at the far end cast a long shadow in the afternoon light. Cecilia had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes when she heard his footsteps on the path. Unhurried, as they always were, as though he had all the time available and intended to use it carefully. He stopped a few feet away. "Did you mean it?" he said. "In the marquee." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the expression she had come to recognize as his truest one. Not the pleasant, managed ease he deployed in company, but the specific attentiveness he reserved for things that mattered to him. The thing that required actually looking. She had spent 6 days performing something. She had spent 4 days trying to locate the edge of the performance. She had spent 2 days being frightened of what she found when she stopped looking for it. She answered him, not with words. She stepped forward and kissed him. And it was not a performance, and it was not a strategy, and it was not anything she had planned or managed or arranged. It was simply the truth, which she had apparently been building toward all week without knowing it. And it felt, when she finally stopped trying to classify it, like the particular relief of a stitch that has finally caught. He kissed her back with the careful, unhurried attention he gave to everything that mattered. And the garden was very still around them. And somewhere inside the house, the wedding breakfast was continuing without them. And neither of them was in any particular hurry to go back. 1 year later, in the garden at Ashfield, the lamps had been carried out for the evening. The light was warm and loose and fell across the table in a way that made everything on it look like something worth keeping. There was a letter on the table. It had arrived that afternoon, and it bore, in the upper left corner, the new sign of the shop, printed cleanly in the style that Dora had suggested, and Cecilia had approved after 3 attempts. Marlowe and Gray, milliners. The name had been the subject of a conversation that had lasted on and off for about 3 weeks. and had ended with Lucian saying that if she was going to argue about it for another month, he was simply going to have it printed without her. And Cecilia saying that she would like to see him try. And both of them knowing by then that argument was one of the primary languages they spoke to each other, and that it suited them very well. Below the printed sign, in Lucian's handwriting, unhurried and specific, the handwriting of a man who chose his words, was a single brief question. It was not a grand question. It was not the kind of question that required a speech or a marquee full of witnesses. It was the kind of question that two people ask each other when they have already answered the larger one and are ready to make it official. Cecilia's answer was already written in the margin. She had written it in the ink she used for the shop accounts, the fine-tipped pen she kept for numbers that needed to be precise. And it was 3 words, and it was entirely clear. And she had written it before she had finished reading the question, because some answers do not require thinking. The lamps burned in the garden. The evening came on slowly, the way evenings do in late summer, when the light is reluctant to go. Inside the house, Eleanor Gray was telling someone about the hat she had worn to the Fenwick Ross wedding, the one that had caused such a favorable comment. And Anne Fenwick Ross, née Marlowe, was laughing at something her husband had said. And the sound of it carried through the open window and out into the garden, where her sister sat at the table with the letter and the lamps and the answer already written. Cecilia set the letter down. She looked at the garden, the yew hedge at the far end, the path between the flower beds, the particular quality of the light at this hour in this place. And she thought that it looked, in the lamplight, exactly like somewhere worth staying. Lucian came out through the door with 2 glasses and set them on the table and sat down across from her. And he looked at the margin of the letter and at her face and said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying. She picked up her glass. He picked up his. The garden held them both, easy and unguarded, in the last of the summer light.